Welcome back. Coming back with my talks, this time about the Norse myths. So let's get started. Primitive men accepted myths at their face value and believed that the recital of a myth and the enactment of rites associated with it gave them great powers. The myth teller was of great importance at the tribe. He or she was the poet come priest come doctor. He could cause rain, for example. Mircea Eliade says, "To know the myths is to learn the secret of their origin of things." In other words, one learns not only how things came into existence, but also where to find them and how to make them reappear when they disappear. Perhaps the only successor to the myth maker is the poet, philosopher, or scientist, who is no prisoner of his own methodology, but is intent upon discovering origin and function and relationship, a man concerned moreover not only with explicable matter but with the spirit. In myth we recognize at once man's age-old anxiety, curiosity and longing, and respond to them. In the history of the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of 793 AD tells of immense windmills and flashes of lightning and fiery dragons flying in the air, followed by a great famine, which brought the Vikings into Lynch Farm, shaking Christendom for the next 300 years. The Vikings became the most influential force in Europe. They brought their own gods, and it was their poets who forged the myths we will discuss in this article. Viking means Veymen, fighting men or setting men. The term Viking refers to the Danes, the Norwegians, and the people from Sweden, Swedes. The Viking Age went from 780 to 1070 AD, and it had a great expansion caused by a few reasons. The first one was an overpopulation and primogeniture, forcing the young into trying fortune overseas. Another reason was to expand trade routes, which attract Viking merchants and pirates. Besides, there was a natural disposition of the Vikings, which seemed to be adventurous, aggressive, and scornful of death, which must have given added momentum to the impulse for raid and trade to conquer and to colonize. Sea power was crucial to the success of the Viking enterprise. We read that they had great navigational skill and superb ships, decorated with dragons on the prow and boats propelled by oarsmen. They colonized Scotland, Ireland, and half England. They colonized part of France, captured Lisbon, Cadiz, and Sevilla, sacking Pisa and Sicily. They reached by rivers Kiev, the Black Sea, and Constantinople. They even reached Baghdad or America in 1000 AD, 500 years before Columbus. Most Norsemen, though, lived peaceful lives, hunting, fishing, and above all, farming. The society was based on a very clear social structuring with three strata: the earls or warriors, the peasants, and the serfs. The Song of Rig tells how Heimdall created the races of men and provides a good deal of information about their respective lifestyles. The Eddaic poem Rikstula shows that the serfs were manual laborers and they were never free. No patron god guarded the lives of these most luckless members of the community. Most Norsemen were peasants and their patron was Thor. They were smallholders and freemen. Their diet included meat, fish, and veggies from locally hunted and domesticated animals and farming. The Rikstula gives a picture of the aristocratic third class, the earls or warriors, whose patron god was Odin. Their wealth was represented on followers, treasure, ships, and states that passed from eldest son to eldest son. In Heimdall's poem, Freyja assists her human lover to establish his lineage. Scandinavian leaders were chosen by their valor and noble birth. With the time, the monarchy became hereditary, even though at the beginning Iceland was ruled by a union of chieftains. We find this at the Lay of Grimir. Earls were family men who spent winters at home. We see that on myths, in which they tell of times spent in feasts in the halls of warriors. These same men recruited men for piracy, trade, or exploration, and were celebrated by skaldic poets. As with other world native societies, the poet was of immense significance as the carrier of tradition in their oral culture. This is very much related to the first words we mentioned in this article. We find isolated, physically demanding lives experienced by most Norsemen, a hard life in a farm. A traveler was unlikely to meet other humans and journeys were frequently demanding, taking the traveler over fells, round a glacier, or across a wilderness with tough weather conditions and short daylight periods over long periods of the year. All of this strengthened the need for family self-reliance. If family member was injured, the offender couldn't get away with it. We see the importance of ties between families. A group was less vulnerable when it was big. A private feud system with compensation with cattle or with life when homicide. Besides, there existed courts to settle disputes. One special relationship existed, the maternal uncle towards his nephew. An example is Odin's 9 magic songs, which enabled him to secure the divine meed of poetry, and which were given by his uncle. Women and men had equal rights, women being able to become a volva or shaman. They were able to go into a trance, send the spirit on a journey, to obtain hidden knowledge, or to resend to a community on welfare queries. As example, we have Freyja in her role as shaman, teaching witchcraft from hall to hall. In the Norse world, there was a superstitious, family-oriented existence. An example is the Lay of Lodfarmir and the Hall of Havamal, a great compendium of aphorisms and advice on right conduct, giving a picture of the day-to-day life of the Norseman. On it we see characteristics such as the below. They value life itself, they censure naivety, cherish and celebrate friendships, beware of treachery, practice moderation, be hospitable, try to win the fame and good name that will outlive you. Immortality is found through fame in the absence of beliefs about timeless afterlife. Men and women, in fact, carved out a name for themselves through bravery, and loyalty and generosity. The Vikings did not believe that could change their destiny, ordained as it was by the norms that wove the fates of gods and men alike. The way they lived was up to them to mend themselves. Fatalism was fundamental to Norsemen, though, reflected in their myths. An example of this is Ragnarok. The destruction of the powers is inescapable. The time must come when all creation will be destroyed by fire and flood. However, a novel quality comes from Norsemen, from Norse myth. The gods are heroic figures, men with a firm sense of values and certain intense loyalties, which would give up to die if necessary. We find in the myths no sense for bitterness at the hardness and unfairness of life, but rather a spirit of heroic resignation. Humanity is born to travel, but courage, adventure, and the wonders of life are matters for thankfulness, to be enjoyed while life is still granted to us. Reading the myths, we identify the Norseman's spirit and confidence. his boundless curiosity, extreme bravery, clannish loyalty, generosity, and discipline. We can detect his arrogance and lack of compassion, his cunning if not treachery, his ruthlessness and his cruelty. Norse mythology tells of the need to cultivate friends and shun enemies, the need to make proper provision when traveling in hostile environment and to treat other travelers with respect, the need for a combination of generosity and thrift, and the need to do that good which is its own reward. Looking at the cosmology of Norsemen, we find that at the beginning they thought there was ice from Niflheim in the north and fire from Muspelheim in the south, who met in the vast chasm of Ginnungagap, and their fusion engendered life. There was the north of Niflheim, made of ice, and the south of Muspel, made of fire. In the middle there was Ginnungagap, emptiness. From the spring Hvergelmir, source of the 11 rivers named the Elibagar, the springs broke into the void. The yeasty venom in them thickened and congealed like slag, and the rivers turned into ice. From the melting and dripping of ice, the giant Ymir was created, a frost giant. A man and a woman grew out of the ooze under his armpit, and one of his legs fathered a son on the other leg. Ymir was the forefather of all the frost giants, and they called him Aurgelmir. A cow was also created from the melting of the ice in Ginnungagap. The cow was named Audumla. The cow and Ymir are seen as symbols of Oriental origin, from Sanskrit perhaps. This influence might date at about 2000 years BC, when Teutonic tribesmen from the Russian steppe lands brought those fundamentals, which moved from Caucasian Asia to Iran, China, Japan, and also to Europe. The cow licked the salty blocks, and by the evening of the first day a man's hair had come out of the ice. From licking 3 consecutive days, the first man, Buri, was born, who became the grandfather of Odin, Vili, and Be. The 3 sons of Bor, or grandsons of Buri, did not have liking for Ymir and the growing gang of the giants, and they killed Ymir. His wounds were like springs, so much blood streamed from them, and so fast that the flood drowned all the frost giants except Belgermir and his wife. Bor's brothers created the 9 worlds with all its elements and the sky from Ymir's body. They made the 4 corners and set a dwarf on each cardinal point. From Muspel, the sun and moon were named, and also the stars. The brothers placed them in the sky. The earth was round and laid within the ring of the deep sea. The sons of Bor marked out tracts of land and gave them to the frost giants and to the rock giants in Jotunheim, where the giants settled and remained. The first 2 humans to populate Midgard were man Ask and woman Embla. They grew up of 2 fallen ash and elm trees. Odin gave them the spirit, Be the hearing and sight, and Vili gave them sharp wits and feeling hearts. The sun and the moon were sons of a human family who were sent to the sky to follow the chariots and the course of the stars. Since then, the moon follows the way and the sun follows behind. The earth was fashioned and filled with men and giants and dwarfs surrendered by the sea and covered by the sky. Then the sons of Bor built their own realm of Asgard, a mighty stronghold, a place of green plains and shining palaces, high over Midgard. The two regions were linked by Bifrost, a flaming rainbow bridge. Norsemen understood the universe as tricentric, formed by three plates, set one above another. At the top there was Asgard, the realm of Aesir or warrior gods. This was the place where it was found Valhalla, a huge hall that housed all the Eingergar, the dead warriors who fought during day and feasted in the evening, awaiting Ragnarok. Ragnarok was the great battle at the end of times between the gods and men, giants and monsters, which occurred at the vast Vigrid plain. In Asgard also lived the house of Vanaheim, where the Vanir or fertility gods lived until they fought and united with the Aesir. The land of the elves of Alfheim was also there. In the middle plate it was found Midgard, where men inhabited. It was surrounded by an ocean where the terrifying Jormungand or wall serpent laid there, surrounding Midgard and biting his own tail. In that place was found Jotunheim, or the Wall of the Giants. The dwarfs lived at the north in Nidavellir, and there was also a land of the dark elves, or Svartalfheim. We find, of course, lack of logic. Norsemen were vague and unconcerned about a more exact geography. The third level was Niflheim, the Wall of the Dead, which was 9 days ride from Midgard. It was bitter cold and of an unending night. As I mentioned, there was 9 walls: Asgard, Vanaheim, and Alfheim, then Midgard, Jotunheim, Nidavellir, and Svartalfheim, and Niflheim, or the Wall of the Dead. The 9th wall was Muspelheim, the land of fire. In that southern hemisphere, light and hot, and the region of flames was found. It burned. The number 9 symbolizes a whole cycle of numbers. 9 has a magical property, and not just in Scandinavia, symbolizing birth, life, death, and rebirth. The axis of those 3 plates and of the 9 walls was the mighty ash tree, Yggdrasil. This tree soared its branches, fanned over gods and men, over giants and dwarfs. Yggdrasil was a timeless tree with not known origin and which survived Ragnarok. In the myth of the Ballad of Svipdag, in which it is explained that women in childbirth ate the fruits of the tree to support their labor, implies that the wall tree was the source of new life. The wall tree was vast and had 3 roots. One of them reached Asgard, where it was found the Well of Urd, or Fate, guarded by the 3 goddesses of destiny. In that well was held a court of justice, the 3 norms lived by fate, being a necessity. Those norms shaped the life of each man. From his first day they sprinkled water on the branches of Yggdrasil and nourished the suffering tree. Under Jotunheim was also found a root on the spring of Mimir, and its waters were the source of wisdom. In Niflheim was the 3rd root, rooting at the spring of Hvergelmir, where the frost giants lived, and it was guarded by wise Mimir. Hvergelmir was the source of the 11 rivers. There the dragon Nidhogg and other unnamed serpents chew at the root, giving insight to those who tasted its water. Odin himself gained knowledge there by learning the 9 powerful songs. Several myths in the cycle concern Odin's relentless quest for wisdom and the way he displayed and used that wisdom. Odin learned from Volvas or seeressers, whom he raised from the dead and from hanged men. And in this myth, Odin made the supreme sacrifice. He died so as to win the occult wisdom possessed only by the dead, and rose again to use that wisdom in the world of the living. In one of the myths, we saw him sacrificing one eye to gain understanding. Yggdrasil was the guardian tree who nourished and suffered from the animals that inhabited it, fed on it and attacked it. Animals fed dripped dew so sweet that bees used it for the making of honey. The tree also served as hidden place for the men and women who survived Ragnarok. As I mentioned, Yggdrasil was sustained by Urd or fate, Skuld or being, and Verlandi or necessity. Everything lied within their hands. We find on that tree the squirrel Ratatosk's carrying of insults between the eagle and the serpent, representing both the division and the unity of heaven and hell. With Yggdrasil we find a visual ladder connecting gods, mankind, the giants and the dead, stretching up to heaven and downwards to the underworld. We find the conception of a road between the worlds familiar in the beliefs of the shamanistic religions. Yggdrasil represents a shamanistic journey. If we look now at the pantheon of gods, we find that excluding Odin and his wife, the goddess Frigg, the Norse pantheon of gods were 12 and the goddesses were 13, which were no less sacred than their male partners, neither less powerful. Odin was the All-Father, the foremost of the gods and father of gods and of the first man and women. He created heaven and earth and the sky. This god justified violence between families, tribes and countries. He seems to have inherited characteristics of the earliest Germanic gods. He was the god of battle, terrible, arrogant and capricious. He inspired victory and determined defeat. He was inspiration for war but also for poetry. As an example, we find him traveling to Jotunheim to win the meed of poetry for the gods, and he was prominent in the Eddaic poems, which seems to imply that he was patron of the poets. He was also a seer. He could travel as a spirit, or he could win wisdom from the dead. In fact, he was the god of the dead. Physically, he had just one eye, wore a hat and a blue cloak, and carried the magic spear, having on his shoulders the ravens Uhin or thought and Munin or memory, birds of battle symbolic also of flights in search of wisdom. Thor was the son of Odin Earth. He was the most loved and respected of the gods and represented order, law and instability. He always wore a hammer called Mjolnir, which kept giants at bay. He is represented as physically strong enough to grapple with the world serpent Jormungand. He was huge, red-bearded, possessed a vast appetite, was quick to lose temper and quick to regain it. He shone as strong as undependable. It is believed that Thor was a creation of a conflict between two religions, and due to this, the god took the fertility part and made it his own, being the hammer an instrument of aggression but also of fertility. Thor is the cause of thunder and lightning and controls the winds and showers, the fair weather and the fruits of the earth. Just as a comparison, in the myth The Lay of Harvard and in the other Norse myths shows the different natures of these two gods. Thor is direct, commonsensical and earthly. Odin is subtle, a deceiver and arrogant. Odin's boasts relate to his progress with women, his magical powers, and his pleasure in stirring up strife and setting princes at one another's throats. Thor's boasts all relate to his role as guardian of gods and men. He goes on in saying that had he not slaughtered giant women, there would be a terrible throne of giants and there would be no men in Midgard. Odin and Thor are shown to be not only dissimilar in character but to protect different social strata, being Thor the protector of to beggarmen and to peasants, and Odin to the nobly born. Freyr is a fertility god, god of plenty, lord of the sun, of the rain and of harvests. He is descendant of Nerthus, the earth mother, invoked to increase the earth and for human growth. His principal possessions were the sheep Skidbladnir and the boar Gullinsborsti, both ancient fertility symbols. His father Nord, the senior god of the Vanir, governed the sea and the winds and guarded ships and seafarers. Nord married the frost giantess Skadi and his sons the frost giantess Gerd, symbolizing the union of opposites. In the myth Skirnir's journey, we see the importance of Nord and of Freyr. On its text, we clearly observe a seasonal fertility myth, when we read that the union of Freyr and Gerd represent the fruitful meeting of sunlight and the frozen earth, and if the myth was a celebration of the sunshine and growth for which Norsemen must have longed after being hid, bound up and cooped up all winter. Heimdall is the leading god, originally one of the Vanir. He is associated with the sea and son of 9 maidens or waves. He is son of 9 mothers of the sea god Aesir. He seems to have connections with the Celtic god of the sea, Manannan. He has a great sight, being able to see 100 leagues in front of him, as well as by night. He also has excellent hearing. He can hear grass growing and wool growing on sheep. He has acutely developed senses, so he was an ideal watchman for the gods. He owned a horn called Jejal, whose blast could be heard throughout the 9 worlds. In the Song of Rig myth, this god appears as the progenitor of the gods, which contradicts Odin's qualities. Tyr, another Norse god and son of Odin, inherited characteristics from earlier Germanic gods of battle. He is the bravest of the Aesir, and only he is prepared to sacrifice a hand so that the wolf Fenrir can be bound, thereby ensuring the safety of the gods until Ragnarok. Ragnarok is precipitated by the death of Balder, the gentle and beloved son of Odin and Frigg, who is felled by a mistletoe dart thrown by his own brother Hot, a blind god whose aim is guided by evil Loki. Balder is good, fair of face and bright, the wisest of the gods, the sweetest spoken and the most merciful. There appears 12 other primordial gods of less mentioning in myth, apart from the ones just mentioned. Onir was involved in the exchange of leaders between the Aesir and Vanir. He appears indecisive and associated with Odin and Loki. He seems to be Odin's successor after Ragnarok. In the myth, the theft of Idun's apples, Odin, Loki and Onir try eating an oxen on a fire which does not cook enough. An eagle is tricked by Loki into making a good fire, and the latter is dragged by the eagle, which is in fact the giant Thrymheim, forcing him to bring Idun and the magic apples out of Asgard. The apples kept the gods young, so without them the eagle intended to remain young forever and to age the gods. At the end the gods managed to get the apples and Idun back. Loki does so by transforming Idun into a nut. It is possible that Idun, originally a goddess of Vanir, just as Honir, was a goddess of fertility, of youth and death. The fact that Idun was transformed into a nut implies that fruit and nuts have been found amongst Scandinavian grave goods to ensure life after death. Irish sagas in fact use nuts as symbols of eternal youth. Loki, son of two giants and yet the foster brother of Odin, embodies the ambiguous and darkening relationship between the gods and the giants. He is represented as dynamic and unpredictable. He appears as the catalyst in many of the myths and the most fascinating character in the entire mythology. Without him, there could be no change in the fixed order of things, no quickening pulse and not Ragnarok. He is handsome and fair of face, but has an evil disposition and is very changeable of mood. He excelled anyone in cunning and always cheats. He is responsible for a wager with a giant which imperils Freyja, but by changing both shape and sex, characteristics he has in common with Odin, he veils out Freyja and the gods. He is mischievous when shifts hair, and his deceit leads to the loss of the golden apples of youth. Loki's origin seems to come from an Indo-European prototype. A trickster, greedy, selfish and treacherous. He takes on animal form, appears in comic and often disgusting situations, yet regarded as a kind of culture hero who provides mankind with sunlight and fire. At times he appears as creator. He can take on male and female form and can give birth to children, a kind of semi-cosmic shaman, halfway between god and hero. He follows also an evolution, appearing at the beginning playful, but with the time gives way to the cruel predator, hostile to the gods. He conspires against Balder. He is also an agent of destruction, causer of earthquakes. Loki is who, at the end, leads the giants and monsters into battle against the gods and heroes. His sons are the serpent Jormungand, the wolf Fenrir, and a half-alive, half-dead Hel. They are extensions of Loki's power within, the only enemies that can affect, corrupt, and finally destroy the spirit of other gods, such as the case of the great Odin. In the myth Loki's children and the binding of Fenrir, we find out that Odin and the gods sent Loki's children, one to the sea, Jormungand, another one Hel into the mist and darkness of Niflheim, and the world beneath the worlds, and Fenrir, though at the beginning is seen as any other wolf, so he is let free in Asgard. After a while, Fenrir started growing bigger and bigger, stronger and stronger, threatening the gods, so the latter tried unsuccessfully to tie him into a chain, which they only accomplished when Tyr, a Germanic god for war and for justice, the precursor of Odin, tied Fenrir into a chain. Tyr, though, loses his right hand, losing a great part of his power, which shows the power of Loki's sons. In Norse myth, we encounter equality male-female goddesses, but not much myth has remained to our days in relation to female goddesses. Freyja is the only divine goddess that has survived. Her father was Nord and her brother was Freyr, and she represents the Vanir. Her husband was Odd. She is the goddess of love, sexually attractive and free with her favors. Her necklace of the breathings is the most striking symbol of the fertility. In the gods and the myths of Northern Europe, H.R. Ellis Davidson writes, "A necklace is something which is associated with the mother goddess from very early times. Some scholars postulate that Freyja's acquisition, her sexual acquisition, is the most salient symbol of her fertility. She is the goddess of love and the goddess of lust. She's also symbol of war. War and death stand shoulder to shoulder, and Freyja, like Odin, had connections with the world of the dead. She is also the mistress of magic and witchcraft, and owns a falcon skin which enables her spirit to take form of a bird, travel to the underworld, and come back with prophecies of and knowledge of destinies. We have though no written proof of Freyja being a seer. Another important female goddess is Odin's wife Frigg, who shared with her husband a knowledge of men's destinies. Her origin is the Earth Mother. She was invoked by women in labor, and her maternal qualities are obvious. In fact, Freyja, Frigg perhaps are two aspects of the fertility goddess in the Near East, appearing as mother and as lover. In Norse myth, this triad or three aspects of womanhood appear side by side as wife and mother, lover and mistress, chaste and beautiful virgin, Frigg, Freyja, Skadi. Giants represent the forces of chaos, attempting through physical force, trickery and magic to upset the order of the universe. An example is the blunt and brutal Geirrod and Hrungnir, or wily and evil Adgarloki. However, the distinction between gods and giants is far from absolute. Some gods have bad qualities, some giants have good qualities, and the gods and the giants do not only fight one another, but form friendships and embark on love relationships. Giants and gods seem to imply opposing aspects of one character, warring, making peace, warring again, and in the end, mutually destructive. In the myth The Marriage of Nord and Skadi, we find the giantess Skadi, who is offered to Nord as wife. They marry together and afterwards found out that neither of them likes living in their partner's land. Skadi does not like the fertile rocking sea of Noatun in Asgard. Nord dislikes Skadi's Thrymheim, icy mountains with howling wolves. They end up deciding to live each on their own. The giantess Skadi freezes again after the covering of long distances, and after being touched by the god of plenty, Skadi is described in the myth as the snowshoe goddess, identified as the embodiment of all that a northern winter could mean: snow, freezing cold, darkness, lack of growth and death. On the other hand, although Nord is especially associated with seafaring and fishing, he was also worshipped with land and wealth and was a fertility god. This myth therefore commemorates some kind of union between a god of life and a figure of death. It brings together opposites: sea level and high mountains, summer and winter, life and death. Hence why the marriage ends up being broken. It shows that extreme opposites deny each other. A struggle to death between a sky god, guardian of men, and an appalling monster, hostile to men, is a commonplace of Indo-European mythology. In Norse myth, the protagonists are Thor and Jormungand, the Midgard serpent. They engage when Thor visits Adgar Loki's court, meet again in the myth the Lay of Ymir, and finally destroy one another at Ragnarok. Dwarfs represent greed. They do nothing that is not representing their own interest. But as the giants were also repositories of knowledge and magic songs, and on occasions revealed their wisdom to the gods. In the myth The Lay of Alvis, this dwarf knows everything about fates and fortunes. He has huge ancient wisdom. He has in fact a huge ancient wisdom. In this myth, we read about dwarves and giants living underground and of their terror of sunlight, which turned them on into stone. Looking at the structure of the myths, we first encounter Odin and his brothers, who created the worlds and their inhabitants, and then it follows a time of peace. Snorri Sturluson, which is one of the most important writers of Norse myths that arrived to our times, characterizes this as the Golden Age, metaphorically because it is pure and untarnished, and literally because the gods' halls, sanctuaries, implements, and utensils were made of gold. This Golden Age ends with a war between the Aesir and the Vanir, the first war in the world. The first war between the gods happened when Odin punished the witch Hulbeglast for gold by riddling her with spears and the Aesir burning to death. This triggers a war between the Vanir and the Aesir, a very tight war. When it becomes clear that neither side will prevail, a truce is called and leaders are exchanged, promising both sides to live side by side. Vanir brought Nord and his son Freyr and Freyja together with wise Kvasir. Nord and Freyr were appointed high priests and Freyja as sacrificial priestess. And the Aesir sent long-legged Onir and wise Mimir to live in Vanaheim. The Vanir is formed by fertility gods and the Aesir are primarily gods of war. It seems that in all versions the Aesir succeed and embrace the Vanir. In the myth we also find the relation of Gulveig, Freyja, and lust for gold, representing Ceres and mistress of witchcraft. These myths might represent the folk memory of hostility between the adherents of two different cults, which were ultimately fused. But no sooner has the Aesir and the Vanir learned to live side by side than in the third myth in the cycle, the recurrent motifs of the myths announce themselves: the antagonism of gods and giants and the ambivalence of Loki. The antagonism of gods and giants can only be seen as the conflict of good and evil. The gods embody aspects of natural and social order. The giants subvert that order and seek to overthrow it. The giant masquerading as a mason visits Asgard. He tricks the gods into a wager involving Freyja, the sun and the moon, but Loki's cunning prevails. The citadel's walls, shattered in the war between the Aesir and the Vanir, are restored into the bargain. At the end, Thor blows from his hammer and shatters the giant's skull. The giant's demand for Freyja, who is the goddess of fertility, is to deprive the gods of the possibility of regeneration, and by taking the sun and the moon, to consign them to eternal freezing darkness into the bargain. Then follows a series of three myths in which the gods win in their encounters with the giants. Odin journeys to the wall of the giants, Jotunheim, to win the sacred myth of poetry. Loki follows in his footsteps to retrieve Idun and the apples of youth. And in a hilarious burlesque, Thor and Loki travel to Jotunheim together, disguised as bride and bridesmaid, to recover Thor's stolen hammer. During this time, the gods sustain losses too. In the myth of poetry myth, the gods fashion a man named Kvasir, who stepped in all matters and mysteries of the nine worlds. Since the fire and ice met in Ginnungagap, Kvasir is a wise man and everyone listens to him. He never intrudes or insists, rather he suggests. Often enough he answers a question with another question. He makes gods and men, giants and dwarfs to feel that they had been helped to answer their own questions. Two dwarfs named Ehalar and Galar murdered Kvasir and tell the Aesir that he dies because he did not have anyone to compete with his wisdom. The dwarfs made honey with Kvasir blood. Anyone tasting that honey would become a poet and a wise man. After an encounter with the giant Baugisutun, the latter obtains the honey. Odin and the gods got to know about the honey, go hunting it, and obtain it by stealing it from the giant. From now on, Odin would be offering from time to time blood to one of the Aesir or to a man of Midgard. To understand this myth, it is important to mention that in the beginning there was the word, and primitive societies venerated poets second only to their leaders. A poet had the power to name and so to control. He was literally the living memory of a group or tribe who would perpetuate their history in song. His inspiration was God-given, and the poet was in effect the medium to transmit the divine. We find in India myths in which breweries and the concept of the divine are mixed, which point at an original story that was shaped and carried to Europe generation after generation in between 1 and 2,000 years ago. Odin does take this responsibility on himself. He is not only the god of war, but the god of poetry and inspiration, and uses honey to transmit it to those who deserve to have such an important role in society. The conflict between gods and giants is all the more tragic because they are also drawn to one another and in many respects resemble one another, because in a sense they are fighting a civil war in which both sides are inevitably the losers. Running parallel to this motive of antagonism is one of love and friendship. Two gods, North and Freyr, marry giantesses, and both Odin and Thor have a number of giant mistresses. The theme of sexual attraction between inhabitants of different worlds persists throughout the cycle. In the myths, there are elements of playfulness and genial humor in many of the myths in the early part of the cycle, but the time of prodigious contests, of thefts and retrievals, and unexpected love matches comes to an end with the myth of Thor's visit to the giant Geirrod. Here, once again, the giants are bent on destroying Thor and unseating the gods, but here it is also apparent that the greatest threat to the gods is not the giants but one of their own number, Loki. In one very famous myth, the beautiful and innocent god Balder is killed by a mistletoe dart, and his return from the dead is prevented by one cynical goddess, Thok, who refuses to weep for him. Loki is the hand that guides the dart, and Loki is the giantess Thok. Balder is finally killed by his brother Hot with the support of Loki. Balder is a passive suffering god, an image who has his origins in the fertility gods of the Near East, Tammuz, Attis, Adonis, Baal and Orpheus. Gods of this kind often died in youth and violent way. In some societies, their death was publicly lamented at festivals held in autumn, as if participants would whip them from the underworld. Their return, sometimes celebrated in spring, was the occasion of jubilation. Similar stories of two brothers, sons of a king, who are killing each other are found in stories such as Beowulf. From this moment on, it is clear that the world is approaching its end. Loki subjects gods and goddesses to vitriolic abuse. He is pursued and fettered. Balder's death reveals Loki as truly evil and cruelly exposes the ultimate limitations and mortality of the gods. The gods may capture and punish Loki, but they cannot retrieve Balder from hell. The beautiful passive god who embodies the qualities of mercy and love is lost to them. They first tried protecting Balder from death, but couldn't stop this event from happening, and afterwards they tried recovering him from hell, but again they failed. Loki is obviously involved in all these events. After Balder, we see on the myth Loki's flighting and on the myth The Binding of Loki that the trickster is becoming more and more nasty towards the gods, insulting them one by one. The gods search for him and Loki hides. knowing the god's intentions of murdering him for his disrespectful words. And driven also by Balder's death, it is on this myth where Loki threatens all the gods and the Aesir with death. On it we see its ironic revelation that the gods are not only glorious but also flawed as the other inhabitants of the nine worlds. In this myth, we see how the gods drag themselves down to Loki's level, insulting and accusing each other. As for Loki, in this myth we experience his transformation from trickster to demon. In these myths, Loki seems to be assimilated to Prometheus in Greek myth or to Satan when he is chained and punished. In here we read Loki's capacity to cause earthquakes. His evil is far too great a force to be entirely contained, and he maintains his capacity to inflict pain on others. At the end, the forces of evil cannot be contained. Loki is punished, but returns and organizes the forces of darkness against the gods. Odin has already learned the future. He knows it is the destiny of gods, giants, men, dwarves, and all creation to fight and destroy one another at Ragnarok. The myth tells that an axe age, a sword age, shields will be gassed. There will be a wind age and a wolf age before the world is wrecked. First of all, Midgard will be wrenched and racked by wars of 3 winters. Fathers will slaughter sons, brothers will be drenched in one another's blood, mothers will desert their menfolk and seduce their own sons, brothers will bet with sisters, the sun, the moon, and the stars will disappear, gods and giants will crash, the 9 worlds will burn. Everything and everyone will extinguish. But a shaft of light penetrates the final darkness of this most fatalistic mythology. Odin has also learned that a new cycle of time and of life will begin after Ragnarok. Balder, several other gods, and 2 humans survive and return to Asgard and Midgard to repopulate the world. The end contains a beginning. The myth tells that the earth will rise again out of the water, fair and green. The eagle will fly over cataracts, swoop into the thunder and catch fish under cracks. Corn will ripen in fields that were never sown. Vidar and Bali will survive. 2 humans, Liv and Livstasir, will survive hidden on Yggdrasil. The author of the book Norse Myths, Kevin Crossley Holland, reminds us rightly that end and beginning, death and rebirth lie at the very heart of every religion. Ragnarok begins with a terrible winter that lasts 3 years. After this, 2 humans hide within Otmimir's wood or Yggdrasil. There seems to be parallels with this myth and Iranian mythology. An Iranian myth describes a terrible winter which put an end to life on earth, with the exception of a few men, women and animals, who escape by hiding in a shelter built by the bisexual Yama. In Celtic mythology, with parallels with the fight at Vigrid, we also find a myth in which, even though total destruction is not achieved, water and fire bring an end to the life cycle, just as at Ragnarok. In fact, terrible cold and intolerable fire leading to melting ice and rapidly rising water levels are experiences with which Icelanders have always been familiar. The concept of a wolf flood, often to purge creation of its wickedness and to usher in a new age of innocence, is fundamental to the human imagination and shared by many mythologies. Norse myth is one of this group of Indo-European myths, ultimately deriving from a common source. Ragnarok shows that the same elements that created life also destroyed it. Ragnarok was written by Voluspa, who definitely was a fatalist. However, he also described the emergence of a new world, a time beyond our time, purged of all evil, new, clean, ready to begin again. Kevin Crossley Holland says that in so doing the poet was transmitting received wisdom, for the beliefs he expresses certainly existed in pre-Christian Scandinavia, but he gives that wisdom new tongue. He faces all the terrors that there are on earth, and having done so, he has won the position to speak with authority of a green heaven and to express our universal longing for rebirth. With these words, I finish my talk. I hope you enjoyed.